The morning they sent Evelyn Harper away, her stepmother didn't even come to the door. She stood at the upstairs window instead, arms crossed, watching with the flat expression of a woman disposing of something she'd long considered useless. Evelyn heard her say it not loudly, not with any particular cruelty, just plainly the way a person states a fact about the weather. At least now she'll be someone else's problem. Evelyn picked up her bag. She did not cry. She had run out of tears for these people a long time ago. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, so drop your city in the comments below, and let's see just how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Evelyn Harper had learned very early in her life that some lessons don't come gently. They come the way a cold wind comes down off a mountain without warning, without apology, cutting straight through to the bone before you even have time to button your coat. She'd been hearing the same lesson since she was old enough to understand words delivered in 100 different ways by 100 different voices, all of them saying the same essential thing. You are not what we wanted. You are not what anyone would want. She was 26 years old on the morning she climbed into the back of a hired wagon outside the Harper family home in Millhaven, Colorado, with a single worn travel bag and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have already done all their grieving in private. The sky above the mountains was pale and wide, streaked with early light, the color of old copper, and the air smelled like pine resin and cold earth, the way it always did in October when the season began to turn serious. The wagon driver, a heavy-set man named Gus, with a tobacco-stained beard and kind eyes, glanced at her over his shoulder as she settled onto the wooden bench behind him. "You traveling far, miss?" he asked. "Far enough," Evelyn said. He nodded and didn't press further. Something in her voice must have told him it wasn't a question she wanted explored. She did not look back at the house as the wagon pulled away. She had decided that the night before, lying in the narrow bed she'd slept in since childhood, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had always looked like a bird with a broken wing, she decided she would not give them the satisfaction of watching her look back. Not her stepmother Ruth, who had spent 12 years making Evelyn feel like a burden placed on the family by God as some kind of punishment. Not her stepsister Clara, who was 22 and lovely in the way that made men stumble over their own feet, and who had spent years letting Evelyn know in small, precise, perfectly aimed ways exactly how wide the distance was between them. Not even her father William Harper, who was not a cruel man by nature, but who had spent years choosing Ruth's comfort over his eldest daughter's dignity, and who Evelyn had slowly, painfully, and finally stopped expecting anything from. She looked forward instead. She looked at the mountains. They were enormous and silent and indifferent, which suited her just fine. The arrangement had been explained to her 3 weeks earlier in the parlor, with the same tone one might use to explain a business transaction involving livestock. Ruth had been the one to speak. Her father had sat in his chair by the window looking out at nothing in particular, his hands folded in his lap like he'd put them there so they'd have somewhere to be. "We've arranged a match," Ruth said. "A rancher up in the high country, goes by Callahan, Wyatt Callahan. He's got a working spread up near the timberline cattle, mostly some horses. He's 35. Widower. Well, not a widower exactly, but close enough. Respectable man from what we've been told." Evelyn had looked at her stepmother the way she'd learned to look at her, steadily, without expression, revealing nothing. "You've arranged a match," she repeated. "It's a good opportunity. For who?" Ruth's mouth had tightened slightly at the corners. "Don't be difficult, Evelyn. The man needs a capable woman who can manage a household. Lord knows you've had enough practice managing ours." There it was. Right there in that sentence, the whole shape of it laid bare. 12 years of Evelyn cleaning, preserving, mending, organizing, managing, doing everything that kept the Harper household functioning, and Ruth had just described it as practice, as training, as preparation for the moment she could be useful to someone else and stop being a problem in this house. "What did you tell him about me?" Evelyn asked. Ruth didn't flinch. "We told him the truth, that you're hardworking and capable." "What else?" A pause, brief, deliberate. "We told him you're not a beauty. that it would be unkind to deceive him on that count. Evelyn's father shifted in his chair. He still didn't look at her. "I see," Evelyn said. And she did see. She saw it with the same awful clarity she'd been seeing things clearly with for years, the particular clarity that comes from learning to look at the world without the comfort of illusions. They had written to a stranger and described her the way you might describe a workhorse. Strong back, plain face, no fuss. Good enough for heavy weather. She had not argued. There was nothing left in this house worth arguing for. What she had done instead was go upstairs to her room and sit on the edge of her bed for a long time, listening to the muffled sound of Ruth's voice downstairs, explaining the situation to Clara, who had laughed, not a mean laugh exactly, but a careless one, the laugh of someone who cannot imagine that laughter could land like a blow. Evelyn had pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed. She was not nothing. She had told herself that every day for years. The way you repeat a word so many times, it stops making sense, and then you keep repeating it anyway, because stopping feels like surrender. She was not nothing. But sitting in that room listening to her stepsister laugh, she had wondered not for the first time, and not for the last, whether she was in danger of believing them. The ranch she was traveling to was called the Callahan Spread. It sat at roughly 8,000 feet elevation above the town of Ridgefall, which itself was barely more than a mercantile, a blacksmith, a church, and a saloon arranged along either side of a dirt road that turned to mud every spring. Gus had been hired to take her as far as Ridgefall, where someone from the Callahan place was supposed to meet her. It was a 3-day journey. On the first day, she and Gus spoke very little. She watched the landscape change as they climbed the flat ranch country, giving way to broken terrain. The cottonwoods giving way to stands of aspen, and then to ponderosa pine. The sky getting bigger and the air getting thinner and colder. She ate the bread and cheese she'd packed for herself and shared some with Gus when he mentioned he hadn't had time for breakfast. "You from around Mill Haven your whole life?" he asked, accepting the bread. "Yes." "Family staying behind?" "They are." He chewed thoughtfully. "Heading up to the Callahan place." She looked at him. "You know it?" "Know of it. Callahan's got a reputation up this way. Keeps to himself mostly. Good rancher. Pays his hands fair." He paused. "Heard he's a hard man." "Hard how?" Gus shrugged. "Hard like a mountain's hard. Not mean. Just weathered. Don't waste words. Don't explain himself much. Men respect him. But he ain't exactly what you'd call warm company." Evelyn absorbed this. "I've lived with cold company before," she said. Gus looked at her for a moment, something shifting in his expression, something that might have been sympathy or might have been recognition. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I reckon you have." On the second day they passed through a small settlement where 3 women were gathered outside a dry goods store, and all 3 of them stopped their conversation to watch the wagon roll by. Evelyn felt their eyes move over her the way eyes always did, measuring, assessing, cataloging. She had spent a lifetime being looked at that way. She had developed the habit of looking back steadily, not with defiance exactly, but with a kind of patient refusal to be the first one to look away. One of the women leaned toward another and said something behind her hand. Evelyn kept her eyes forward. That night, camped beside a creek that chattered over flat stones in the darkness, she lay on her bedroll and listened to the sound of the water and the wind in the pines and the distant occasional call of an owl, and she thought about what kind of man Wyatt Callahan was. She tried to construct him in her mind. 35. A rancher. A man who'd wanted a capable wife and had been willing to take her sight unseen on the recommendation of people who had described her primarily in terms of what she was not. What kind of man did that a desperate one maybe? Or a practical one? Or a man who had given up on something and was willing to settle for something else? She wondered if she would see it in his face when he looked at her for the first time. That particular expression, polite, controlled the expression of someone accepting a disappointment with grace. She had seen it before, more times than she cared to count. She had seen it in the eyes of the one man who had ever courted her briefly and disastrously 3 years ago. A merchant's son named Philip, who had initially shown interest because her father had land, and ended up showing her in 100 small, humiliating ways over 3 months that he found her wanting. He had never said it directly, Men like Philip never did. They just let it show in their eyes. She was not going to let that expression break her again. Whatever Wyatt Callahan was, she would manage it. She had managed worse. On the morning of the third, they came down through a pass and saw a ridge fall below them. A thin scattering of structures in the fold of the valley. Smoke rising from two chimneys, a few horses tied at the rail outside the saloon. Gus brought the wagon down the slope carefully, the horses picking their way along the rocky trail, and by mid-morning they were rolling along the main street. "I'll stop at the Mercantile," Gus said. "They'll know if someone from Callahan's is in town." The man from Callahan's turned out to be a ranch hand named Darnell, a lean, laconic young man of about 20, who met them outside the Mercantile, took one long look at Evelyn as she climbed down from the wagon, and then very deliberately looked at something else. "Miss Harper?" he asked, addressing a point somewhere to the left of her shoulder. "That's me," she said. "I've got horses. It's another 2 hours up to the spread." "Then we'd better start." He nodded and went to collect the horses, and Evelyn turned to Gus and held out her hand. He shook it properly, which she appreciated. Men who shook a woman's hand the way they'd shake a man's were a particular kind of respectful that she'd learned to notice and value. "Thank you for the company," she said. "Good luck to you, miss," he said. And then quietly looking at her directly, "I mean that sincerely." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know you do," she said. "Thank you." She picked up her bag and followed Darnell. The ride up to the Callahan spread was steep and largely silent, which suited her. Darnell rode a few lengths ahead, which she didn't take personally. She had the impression he was one of those young men more comfortable with horses than with words, and she had no interest in forcing conversation out of someone who didn't want to have it. She focused instead on the landscape, which grew wilder and more dramatic. The higher they climbed, gray rock faces streaked with dark mineral stands of spruce, the occasional clearing where golden grass bent in the wind. She could see the ranch before they reached it. The main house was substantial, not grand, but solid, built from timber and stone, with the kind of proportions that said, this was built to last, not to impress. There were 2 large barns, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and a series of fenced pastures where cattle moved in slow, peaceful clusters. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house. The whole thing had the look of a place that worked hard and took itself seriously. There were 3 men visible in the yard when they rode in. 2 of them were ranch hands engaged in some task near the smaller barn. The third was standing near the fence of the near pasture, not doing anything in particular, just standing there looking at the cattle. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered. Tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy canvas coat and a wide-brimmed hat that was dark with age and use. He turned when he heard the horses coming, and she saw his face. Weathered was the right word for it. Gus had been accurate there. Weathered and angular and serious, with the kind of lines around the eyes that come from years of squinting into wind and sun. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A jaw that looked like it didn't move much when it didn't need to. He walked toward them as Darnell and Evelyn brought the horses to a stop. His stride was unhurried, and even the stride of a man accustomed to covering ground without wasting effort. Evelyn dismounted before he reached them. She straightened her coat, smoothed her skirt, and faced him. She watched his eyes. This was the moment. This was always the moment, that first fraction of a second, when a person's face told the truth before they had a chance to arrange it into something more socially acceptable. Wyatt Callahan's eyes moved over her once quickly, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not quite what she'd expected. Not the polite disappointment. Not the careful blankness that said, I am hiding something. An assessment, yes, but not the kind she was accustomed to. The kind that wasn't looking for what it wanted and finding something less. The kind that was simply looking. He stopped in front of her and pulled his hat from his head. "Miss Harper," he said. His voice was low and measured, the kind of voice that was used to being heard across distances. "Mr. Callahan," she said. A pause. He turned his hat in his hands once, something that might have been a habitual gesture. "I'd have sent a better wagon if I'd known the road was in the shape it's in," he said. "I hope the ride wasn't too rough." She blinked. Of all the things she had prepared herself for him to say, of all the expressions she had prepared herself to receive, I'd have sent a better wagon had not been among them. It was fine, she said. I've managed rougher. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. Darnell, he said without looking away from her. Take care of the horses. Miss Harper, come inside. You'll want something warm after that ride. He didn't wait for a response. He put his hat back on and walked toward the house, clearly expecting her to follow. Not in the way of a man who expected obedience, but in the way of a man who assumed she had basic needs that needed to be met and was prepared to address them. Evelyn picked up her bag and followed him. The inside of the house was clean and spare and slightly cold, the fire in the main room having burned low. There was a large table, a good number of plain wooden chairs, shelves along the wall with everything on them, arranged with a kind of rough order that said someone had tried but not particularly succeeded at domestic organization. A rifle above the door, a coat on a hook. The smell of wood smoke and coffee and something saddle leather maybe worked into the walls over years. Sit down, Callahan said, moving toward the fireplace to stoke the fire. I'll put coffee on. I can do that, Evelyn said. Sit down, he said again, the same tone, no impatience in it, just a statement of what was going to happen. She sat. She watched him build up the fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, then fill the coffee pot at the pump and set it over the rebuilt flames. He moved around the kitchen with the comfortable familiarity of a man who'd lived alone long enough to have figured out how everything worked. But there was something in the way he moved, slightly too careful, slightly too contained, that suggested he was aware of her watching him and wasn't quite sure what to do with that. Good, she thought. At least they were both uncertain. He brought 2 cups of coffee to the table and sat down across from her. He wrapped his hands around his cup and looked at her directly the way he had in the yard, that same steady, assessing look that she still couldn't entirely categorize. I want to say something, he said, before we get into anything else. All right, she said carefully. The letter I received from your family described you in terms I found. He paused, choosing the word with visible care. Functional is how I'd put it, like they were advertising equipment. Evelyn said nothing. I want you to know, Wyatt Callahan continued, his voice perfectly level, that I'm not interested in equipment. I wrote back asking about you, your actual self, not your list of capabilities, and they didn't seem to understand the question, which I found concerning. He took a sip of coffee. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to spend any time here wondering whether you need to prove your worth to me. You don't. Whatever they told you about why you're here. I invited you here because I was hoping to find someone worth knowing. If that turns out to be you, I'll consider myself fortunate. The silence in the room after he stopped speaking was very large. Evelyn looked at him across the table. At the weathered face and the careful eyes and the hands wrapped around the coffee cup. At the man who had just said plainly and without any particular drama the thing that no one in her family had ever managed to say to her. Not in 26 years. She felt something shift in her chest, something she couldn't quite name, something that might have been hope, or might have been grief, or might have been both at once, that particular combination that happens when you've needed something for so long that receiving it causes you pain before it causes you relief. She would not cry, not here, not in front of this stranger. That's a fair thing to say, she managed. I appreciate it. He nodded, accepting this, and returned to his coffee. They sat in the spare kitchen with the fire building warmth around them, and outside the window, the mountain afternoon was going silver and cold, and for the first time in a very long while, Evelyn Harper did not feel like a problem waiting to be solved. She didn't know yet what this place was. She didn't know yet what this man was, but she knew what she was, even if she'd spent years being told otherwise, and she set her hands around the warm cup and breathed in the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and thought, all right, we'll see what this is. The first week passed in a rhythm that was unfamiliar in a way she couldn't quite identify at first, and then gradually it was unfamiliar because it was calm. At the Harper house. The household had operated according to a particular kind of tension, the constant low-grade anxiety of never quite knowing what Ruth wanted, never quite having done enough, never quite being the right shape for the space you were occupying. Evelyn had spent 12 years moving through that tension, The way you move through cold water steadily and carefully, always slightly braced. The Callahan spread was different. Things needed doing, and she did them, and they were done, and no one commented on them one way or the other, which struck her as almost luxurious. The kitchen was functional, but poorly organized, and she reorganized it the second morning, moving things to where they made sense instead of where they'd ended up. The root cellar was damp, and the preserves stored there were at risk, and she identified the problem and remedied it. There were household accounts being kept in a haphazard system that made it nearly impossible to track anything accurately, and she spent 2 evenings untangling it and setting it in order. She did these things because they needed doing. She expected no acknowledgement. On the 4th, she came into the kitchen to find Wyatt already there, coffee made sitting at the table, looking at the reorganized shelves with an expression she couldn't read. "You moved things," he said. She stopped in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. "Yes. It made more sense to I should have asked. I'm sorry, I can put it back." "No." He turned away from the shelves. "I was going to say it makes more sense now. I never could find the coffee without looking for it for 5 minutes. Now I can see it from the door." A pause. "Thank you." She looked at him. "You're welcome," she said, and poured herself coffee, and that was that. Small moments. That was how the first week built itself, in small moments, each one slightly different from anything she'd experienced in the Harper house, collectively amounting to something she was still too cautious to name. She met the ranch hands formally on the 3rd day, 4 of them in total of varying ages and dispositions. Darnell, she already knew or knew of. There was a man called Hector, 50-ish, and heavyset, who ran the cattle operations, and who looked at her with the particular wariness of someone who had seen previous arrangements in this house go badly. There was young Pete, who could not have been more than 17, and who regarded her with an open curiosity that was at least honest. And there was a woman Evelyn hadn't expected, a woman named May Dawson, who came up from Ridgefall 3 days a week to help with the heavier laundry, and who greeted Evelyn with the measured assessment of someone reserving judgment. "You're not what I expected," May said the second time she came. "What did you expect?" Evelyn asked. May considered this. "Someone smaller," she said. "Quieter. Most women who get sent up here to marry ranchers, they're scared half to death of the altitude." "I'm not scared of altitude," Evelyn said. "I can see that." May tied her apron strings. "Good. The altitude doesn't care if you're scared of it anyway." It was the most practical compliment Evelyn had received in years, and she found she liked it far better than the ornamental kind. Wyatt Callahan himself proved to be in those early days exactly what Gus had described. Not cold, but contained. He said what he needed to say, and not much else. He was present at meals, but not especially conversational. He worked hard, and expected the same from everyone around him, without making a particular point of it. He was unfailingly courteous to her, not in a formal, strained way, but in the practiced way of someone for whom basic courtesy was simply a habit, like washing your hands before eating. He did not treat her like a servant. He did not treat her like an ornament. He treated her, she slowly realized, like a person. With the same matter-of-fact respect, he extended to his hands the same assumption of competence, the same willingness to say a thing plainly and expect a plain answer back. It was the most unusual experience of her adult life. On the 8th evening after supper, she was sitting at the table with the accounts when he came in from his final check on the stock. He poured himself coffee, and instead of taking it to his chair by the fire as he usually did, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked up. "How are you finding it?" he asked. "The place. It's a lot of work," she said honestly. "The pantry situation is better now, but the root cellar still has a drainage problem that's going to cause serious losses before winter if it's not addressed." He nodded slowly. "I know about the drainage. I've been meaning to have Hector look at it. I can tell you exactly where the problem is if that helps. I spent some time down there yesterday." He looked at her steadily. "You spent time in the root cellar?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because it needed addressing, and I was available to address it." A moment of silence. "Most people," he said, "would have mentioned it and waited for someone else to go figure it out." "I'm not most people," Evelyn said, and then felt immediately self-conscious about saying it because it sounded like bragging, and she hadn't meant it that way. But Wyatt Callahan just looked at her with that careful, measured look and said, "No, I'm beginning to understand that you're not." He drank his coffee. She returned to the accounts. The fire crackled. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines with its low, constant voice. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not the kind of moment that announces itself as significant while it's happening. But later, much later, when Evelyn looked back at the particular shape of that first month at the Callahan spread, she would recognize that evening. The accounts book open on the table, the coffee cups, the quiet man sitting across from her saying, "I'm beginning to understand that you're not as the moment when something that had been braced against itself for 26 years began very slowly, very carefully to uncurl." She didn't know it yet, but the mountain was beginning to keep her. And 3 weeks after her arrival, the first thing happened that told her the rest of the valley was paying attention. She had gone into Ridgefall with May to collect supplies. The mercantile was run by a man named Aldous Finch, who was also the closest thing Ridgefall had to a social hub, which meant that anything said within his store walls made its way through the entire settlement within 24 hours. Evelyn had been in there twice before, and both times had been aware of the careful, curious quality of the attention she received. Not unfriendly exactly, but evaluating the attention of people who'd heard about Callahan's new wife and were forming their opinions. This time, 2 women were already in the store when she and May arrived. Evelyn recognized one of them, the wife of a man who ran cattle in the lower valley, a woman named Dorothy Price, who was probably 50 and had the carriage of someone accustomed to being the most important woman in whatever room she was in. Dorothy Price looked at Evelyn the way Evelyn's stepmother Ruth had always looked at her, the sweep of the eyes that cataloged and dismissed in a single motion. Too practiced to be called rude, but too deliberate to be called anything else. "You're the Callahan woman," Dorothy Price said. "I am," Evelyn said. "Well." Dorothy glanced at her companion, who found something interesting to look at on the shelf beside her. "We heard he'd brought someone up from the low country. I suppose you'll be finding it quite different up here." "Different from what?" Evelyn asked pleasantly. A slight pause. Dorothy had expected deference, or at least discomfort. She rearranged her expression slightly. "Different from wherever you came from, of course. This isn't an easy place to settle. Not everyone manages it." "I imagine not," Evelyn said. She turned to the counter. "Good morning, Mr. Finch. I need to collect the order Mr. Callahan put in last week." She could feel Dorothy Price's eyes on her back. May, standing beside her, made a small sound that might have been suppressed laughter. When they were outside again loading the wagon, May said, "You handled that well." "She was testing me," Evelyn said. "She tests everyone. It's her hobby." May handed up a sack of flour. "You didn't flinch." "I've been tested by people with more practice than she has," Evelyn said. May looked at her, and in her eyes was something Evelyn recognized, the recognition of one woman who'd survived difficult things, seeing that same quality in another. "Yes," May said simply. "I reckon you have." It was on the ride back to the ranch that Evelyn noticed the way the valley looked from the road spread out below the mountain in the pale October light. The grassland and the waterways and the patchwork of ranching operations. All of it contained in the wide arms of the peaks on either side. It was beautiful. She had not let herself think about whether it was beautiful before, because beauty felt like the kind of thing you could afford to notice only when you felt secure enough to look at something other than what was immediately in front of you. She let herself notice it now, and something in her chest moved. Not hope, yet not quite, but the early tremor of it, the warning sign before the thing itself arrives. She was 26 years old, and she was sitting in a wagon on a mountain road, and the valley was beautiful, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she did not know what was going to happen next. That uncertainty had always frightened her before. Today, just slightly, it felt like something else. It felt like possibility. She straightened her back and held the reins, and let the mountain wind touch her face. "All right," she thought again for the second time since she'd arrived. "All right. We'll see what this is." She did not know yet how much the valley would ask of her. She did not know yet what she would discover about herself in answering. But the wagon moved steadily up the mountain road, and the peaks rose above her in the cold, clear air. And Evelyn Harper, the daughter. Her family had given away. The woman no one had chosen the problem. They had sent somewhere else to become someone else's, kept her eyes open, and rode toward whatever was waiting. The thing about healing Evelyn would come to understand was that it didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with ceremony, or with any particular sense of occasion. It arrived the way winter light arrived on the mountain, gradually, incrementally, and always when you were looking at something else. She had been at the Callahan spread for exactly 3 weeks and 4 days, when the first thing happened that she couldn't explain away. She had spent the morning working on the household accounts again, cross-referencing supply costs against what Wyatt had paid out over the previous quarter, and she'd found a discrepancy, not large but consistent, the kind of consistent that meant it wasn't an error. Someone had been systematically padding the supply invoices from the mercantile. Not by much. Just enough to skim off a small margin on every order, small enough that a man who wasn't looking carefully would never notice. But Evelyn had spent 12 years managing a household on a budget that Ruth kept deliberately tight, and she noticed. She sat with it for a full hour before she decided what to do. She could have left it alone. It wasn't her business, strictly speaking. She was 3 weeks into this arrangement, still more guest than wife, in any real sense, and inserting herself into ranch finances was the kind of thing that could go very wrong. She thought about Ruth, about how Ruth would have reacted if Evelyn had ever raised a concern about the household finances without being asked. Then she thought about Wyatt, about the way he'd looked at her across the table and said, "I was hoping to find someone worth knowing." She picked up the accounts book and went to find him. He was in the smaller barn, working on a piece of harness that had snapped his hands, moving through the repair with the patient, methodical attention he brought to everything. He looked up when she came in, registering her expression. "Something wrong?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to ask you something about the supply invoices." She showed him the discrepancy. She walked him through it, where it appeared, how often, in what amounts, the pattern that made it clear it was deliberate. She did it calmly and without drama, the way she'd learned to present information to people who needed facts rather than feelings. Wyatt set down the harness and looked at the numbers for a long time. "You found this going through the accounts," he said. "Yes." "How long has it been going on?" "At least 14 months based on what I can see. Possibly longer, but the older books aren't organized in a way that lets me trace it clearly." He looked up at her. Something moved through his expression, not anger, not yet, but the tightening of something that had been loose. "Who knows you found this?" he asked. "No one. I came straight to you." Another pause. "You could have left it alone," he said. 3 weeks here. Most people would have left it alone." "Most people would have," she agreed. "Why didn't you?" She met his eyes. "Because it's your money, and someone's taking it, and you deserve to know." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment, that same steady, unreadable look she was slowly learning to read anyway, beneath its surface. And then he nodded once, the way he always nodded when something had been settled. "All right," he said. "Let me see the full picture." They spent 2 hours at the kitchen table going through it together. Wyatt asked precise questions, and she gave precise answers, and at no point did he suggest she might be mistaken, or that she'd misread the numbers, which she appreciated more than she was going to say out loud. By the end of it, they had identified the source. Finch at the mercantile had been inflating the invoices, and presumably splitting the difference with whoever picked up the orders in town, which meant one of the ranch hands was involved. "I'll handle it," Wyatt said. "I know you will," she said. He looked at her again. "Thank you, Evelyn." It was the first time he'd used her name. She felt it land somewhere in her chest, and stayed very still so as not to show it. "You're welcome," she said. He handled it the next day quietly and without drama, the way he handled everything. Finch paid back what he owed in exchange for Wyatt, not involving the county sheriff and the ranch hand, who'd been collecting the split. A man named Garver, who'd only been on the spread 6 months, was let go that afternoon with his wages and a brief private conversation that Evelyn was not present for and did not ask about. The other hands knew something had happened. They looked at her differently after that, not with hostility, but with a careful new attention, the attention of people recalibrating. Hector came and found her 2 days later while she was in the kitchen putting up preserves. He stood in the doorway for a moment, big arms crossed, looking at a point slightly above her head. "What you did with those accounts," he said. "Yes," she said. "Good thing." He uncrossed his arms. "Garver's been a problem for a while. Nobody could figure out how to prove it." "I just looked at the numbers," she said. He turned to go, then stopped. "You need help moving those shelves in the root cellar so the drainage work can get done. Let me know." He left. Evelyn looked at the empty doorway for a moment, then turned back to her preserves. That was how it happened. Not in grand gestures, not in declarations, but in the small, accumulated weight of small moments. Hector offering help with the root cellar. Pete appearing one morning to fix the hinge on the kitchen door without being asked because he'd noticed it was sticking. May arriving on her third weekly visit and saying without preamble, "Dorothy Price is telling people in town you tricked Callahan into the marriage. I thought you should know." Evelyn set down the cloth she'd been folding. "What exactly is she saying? That your family misrepresented you. That her word was scheming." May's tone made her opinion of this word clear. "She's saying a woman like you couldn't have come up here for honest reasons." "A woman like me," Evelyn repeated. Her words. Evelyn looked at the folded cloth. She thought about Dorothy Price's eyes in the mercantile, that cataloging sweep that weighed and dismissed. She thought about Ruth's voice saying, "We told him you're not a beauty." She thought about the way certain people looked at her, had always looked at her, and decided immediately that whatever they saw was an explanation for why she couldn't be trusted. "Let her say it," Evelyn said. May tilted her head. "That's all. People who say things like that aren't looking for evidence to the contrary. They've already decided. Arguing just gives them more to work with." She picked up the cloth again. "Let her say it. The work will answer it eventually or it won't, and either way, I'm not going to spend my energy on Dorothy Price." May was quiet for a moment. Then, "Callahan knows she's saying it." "I don't know. He will soon. This valley isn't big." May paused. "You should probably know she was interested in him herself before you came. Years back. Nothing came of it. Her husband's still alive, but—" She shrugged. "Just useful information." Evelyn absorbed this without expression. "Thank you for telling me." "Don't thank me. Just keep your eyes open." She did. That same evening, Wyatt came in from the south pasture later than usual, and when he sat down at the table there was a quality to his silence that was different from his ordinary silence, a little sharper, a little more deliberate. "I heard something in town today," he said. "About me, I'd imagine," she said. He looked at her. "You know, May told me this morning." He turned his cup in his hands. That habitual gesture, she'd come to recognize it now as something he did when he was thinking rather than speaking. "I want to know what you think." "About Dorothy Price." "About what she's saying. Whether it bothers you." Evelyn considered him. "Does it bother you?" she asked carefully. "What she's saying?" A pause. "I'm asking you. And I'm asking you back. Because if you're wondering whether her story has any truth to it, that's a different conversation than if you're just asking whether her talking about it bothers me." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not wondering whether it has truth to it." "Good," she said. "Then it bothers me the way it would bother anyone to be gossiped about. But it doesn't frighten me. I've been managing what people say about me for 26 years. I have some practice." Something shifted in his expression. A small thing. A softening that wasn't quite soft, more like the easing of a tension held long. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They ate supper. The fire made its sounds. Outside, the mountain was as dark and enormous and utterly indifferent to Dorothy Price. But the conversation had done something cracked, something open between them, some small window that hadn't been there before. Because after supper, instead of taking his coffee to his chair and reading as he usually did, Wyatt stayed at the table, and after a few minutes of silence that was comfortable rather than awkward, he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. "What was it like where you came from?" She looked at him. "You mean the Harper house?" "Yes." She thought about it. Not about whether to answer, she had already decided she wasn't going to be coy with this man, but about how to answer accurately. How to describe 12 years in a house where you were simultaneously indispensable and invisible without making it sound like complaint. It was hard, she said. Not in the way that mountain ranching is hard. In a different way. In the way where you can do everything exactly right, and it still won't be right, because the real problem isn't anything you've done. It's that you're not what the person wanted, and no amount of doing right will change that. She paused. My stepmother wanted daughters who were easy to be proud of. I wasn't easy. I was practical and direct and large, and I had opinions. I didn't always manage to keep to myself, and those things were not. They weren't what she'd hoped for when my father married her. Your father, Wyatt said. What was he? Absent, she said. The word came out cleaner than she'd expected without the emotion she usually had to suppress around it. Not physically, just absent. He was in the room and not in it at the same time. He loved me, I think. In the way that someone can love you and still fail to protect you, because protecting you requires conflict, and he couldn't tolerate conflict. Wyatt said nothing. How was the one who agreed to this arrangement? She said. I want to be clear about that. Ruth decided it, but he agreed to it. He sat in his chair and looked out the window while she told me, and he didn't say a word, and I think that was the last thing I needed to understand about what I was to him. The silence after this was the kind that had texture, the kind that wasn't empty, but full of something neither of them was quite ready to name. I'm sorry, Wyatt said. Don't be, she said. It brought me here. And then she stopped, because she hadn't planned to say that, and she wasn't entirely sure what she'd meant by it, and she suddenly felt exposed in a way she hadn't since she'd arrived. She stood up and cleared the cups. Wyatt watched her, and she felt his watching, but didn't turn around, and when she finally moved away from the table, he said quietly to her back, I'm glad it did. She kept moving, but she was glad the kitchen was dim enough that he couldn't see her expression. She was glad she'd come here. She understood that now. However this turned out, whatever shape it ultimately took, she was glad she had left Millhaven, and she was glad she had come here, and she was glad that the man sitting in the kitchen behind her was the kind of man who said plain true things in a plain voice, and didn't require her to perform gratitude for them. That was the 5th week. The 6th week was when she started to understand what the ranch could be, not just what it was. Functional, solvent, well run in the ways that a man running it alone could manage, but what it could be with a second set of hands and eyes and ideas. She had spent her whole life managing a household, and she had always managed it under constraint, under Ruth's arbitrary vetoes and limited budgets, and the constant requirement to do things the way they'd always been done, because Ruth found change threatening. Here, there were no such constraints. When she suggested they start storing the root vegetables differently to reduce rot losses, Wyatt said, "Show me." When she pointed out that the kitchen garden had been planted in a pattern that was making poor use of the sun exposure, he said, "Do it different next season." When she asked whether he'd considered adding a second smokehouse to handle larger quantities of meat before winter, he pulled out a pencil and said, "Where would you put it?" This was something she had never experienced. The experience of being asked. The experience of proposing and being taken seriously instead of tolerated. The experience of her knowledge being treated as knowledge rather than as the unfortunate opinions of someone who didn't know their place. She began to expand, not physically. Though the mountain air and the honest physical work of the ranch were doing things for her body that years of indoor labor never had a kind of strength that felt different from mere endurance. But internally, in the space she took up in herself, she began to say things in full sentences instead of half sentences. She began to offer ideas without qualifying them to death first. She began very slowly to stop waiting for the correction that never came. The ranch hands noticed. Pete told her one afternoon with the blunt honesty of 17 that she was way less nervous than when you first came. "I wasn't nervous," she said. "Ma'am," he said with great patience, "you were very nervous." She almost laughed. "All right," she said. "Maybe a little." "You're not anymore, though," he said. "It's better. The cook we had before you left, she was nervous all the time too, and she burned the biscuits every other day from it." I don't burn biscuits, Evelyn said. No, ma'am, Pete agreed. That's what I'm saying. She did laugh then, and Pete looked pleased with himself, and Hector, who had overheard the whole exchange from 10 feet away, made no comment but smiled briefly at his work. She was becoming part of the place. She could feel it happening, the way you can feel a season changing, not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small signs. The light shifting the air, shifting the particular way, things begin to feel ordinary that once felt strange. The morning sound of the ranch, the smell of the kitchen, the rhythm of meals and work, and the long quiet evenings. And Wyatt. She would be honest with herself, if not with anyone else, about what was happening with Wyatt. Something was happening. It was not fast. He was not a fast man. He moved through everything in his life the way he moved through the yard, with a measured, unhurried confidence that said he was not afraid of arriving a little slower if it meant arriving right. But it was there, accumulating in small deposits, compounding in the way that quiet things compound when they're left alone to grow. The conversations were the first thing. They had begun at that kitchen table the night she'd talked about her father, and they had continued. Not every night, not even most nights, but often enough that she had begun to look forward to them in a way she examined carefully. Worried about what it meant to look forward to something you couldn't be sure of. He talked about the ranch. He talked about the cattle, about the water rights disputes that had been simmering in the valley for 3 years and would eventually require a legal fight he wasn't looking forward to. He talked about the winter ahead and how it would compare to the previous one, which had been hard enough to kill 11 head and strand 2 of his hands in the upper pasture for 6 days. And sometimes, rarely, he talked about other things. You had a woman you were going to marry, she said one evening, not cautiously, just directly, because she'd learned he responded better to directness than to careful approaches. He was quiet for a moment. May told you. She mentioned it. I'm asking you. He turned his cup. Her name was Caroline. We were together 4 years before. He stopped. She didn't die. I want to be clear about that because people sometimes say widower and mean something gentler. She left. She came up here for 2 winters and decided this life wasn't what she'd wanted, and she went back east, and I don't... He paused again. I don't hold it against her. This is a hard place. Not everyone can take to it. You loved her, Evelyn said. Yes. And she leaving, that was when you stopped. Believing it was worth trying again, he said. Yes. He looked at her. I don't say that to... I know why you say it, she said. You're saying it so I understand what you were expecting when I arrived. Yes. Which was nothing, she said. Which was someone practical, he said. Which is different from nothing. I thought a practical arrangement. That's what I thought I wanted. And now? She asked, and then felt the question land in the air between them like something dropped. He looked at her. The fire moved. And now, he said slowly, carefully, I think I may have been wrong about what I wanted. The silence after that was very large. Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. She thought about all the years she'd spent being told what she wasn't, and she thought about this man sitting across from her saying he might have been wrong about what he wanted, and she felt the old fear rise, the familiar terrible fear that she would believe something, and it would be taken away, that she would let herself trust something, and the ground would shift. I need you to know something, she said. Tell me, he said. I have spent most of my adult life being treated as a solution to other people's problems, as something functional, something useful. And I have done the work, I have always done the work because that's who I am, not because I was performing for anyone. But I need... She stopped, started again. If anything is going to be different here, it needs to be different because of who I am, not what I can do. I can't go through that again. I won't. The silence. Evelyn, he said. Yes, look at me. She looked at him. I know the difference, he said. 3 words. Quiet. Absolute. She held his gaze. All right, she said at last. All right, he said. The fire. The mountain dark outside. Something settling between them, not resolved, not finished, not ready to be called what it might eventually be called, but something set in a different orientation than it had been an hour ago, pointed somewhere. She went to bed that night with her hands pressed flat against her sternum, feeling her own heartbeat, thinking, careful. Careful. You know how to want things and not get them. Be careful. But under the careful running beneath it like a current, something is happening here. Something real. She was right. And she had not yet understood how completely being right about that was going to cost her. Because 7 weeks and a letter arrived. It came with the regular post delivery, addressed to Wyatt, but the return name on the envelope made Evelyn's stomach drop when she happened to see it on the hall table before Wyatt picked it up. William Harper, Mill Haven, Colorado. Her father had written to her husband. She said nothing. She went about the morning's work and said nothing, and when Wyatt came in at midday and picked up the letter, she was in the kitchen and heard the sound of the envelope being opened and still said nothing. She focused on the bread she was making with the particular intensity of someone who is using physical labor to hold something else at bay. He came to the kitchen doorway 10 minutes later. "Your father's written to me," he said. "I know," she said. "I saw the envelope. You didn't say anything." "It's your letter. It wasn't my business until you decided to make it my business." He looked at her for a moment, then crossed to the table and set the letter down in front of her. She wiped her hands and read it. It was written in her father's careful, slanted hand, the handwriting she'd grown up watching write ledger entries and correspondence. The handwriting she associated with a man who was meticulous about small things and catastrophic about large ones. "Dear Mr. Callahan, I write to inquire after the well-being of my daughter Evelyn and to convey the regards of her family. We have been concerned about her adjustment to the mountain life, as she is not always the most adaptable of spirits. We hope you have found her useful in the domestic capacity and that the arrangement has been satisfactory. We also write regarding a small matter of family property." Evelyn stopped reading. She set the letter down very carefully. "Family property," she said. "Keep reading," Wyatt said. She picked it back up. The letter went on for 2 more paragraphs. Buried in them, written in the same careful, measured hand as the rest, was the substance of what her father wanted: a water easement. A portion of land along the creek that ran through the northern edge of the Callahan, spread land that had once belonged to Evelyn's mother's family land, that had come to the Callahan property through a purchase made some years before Evelyn was born. Her father was claiming delicately, politely, with all the careful language of a man who knew he was asking for something he wasn't entitled to, that there had been a misunderstanding in the original sale, and that the water rights along that section of the creek rightfully belonged to the Harper family. Her mother's land. They were using her mother's land. "That land was sold fair," Evelyn said. Her voice was very level. 22 years ago. My father knows that. He handled the sale himself." "Yes," Wyatt said. "He did." "He's lying." "Yes," Wyatt said again. "He is." She set the letter down again. She thought about her father in his chair by the window, hands folded in his lap, looking at nothing while Ruth explained that Evelyn was being sent away. She thought about 3 weeks of travel and the old bag and the October morning, and at least now she'll be someone else's problem. They hadn't sent her away because they didn't want her. They'd sent her away because they'd wanted her here. Because somehow, through some information, she didn't yet have the full shape of some knowledge they had about the water rights, about the creek, about what the land was worth. They had decided that having Evelyn married to Wyatt Callahan gave them leverage. They had arranged this marriage as a land play. She was not a daughter they'd disposed of. She was a piece they'd placed. "Evelyn," Wyatt said. "Give me a moment," she said. He gave her a moment. The bread dough sat on the table between them, forgotten. The kitchen was very quiet. When she looked up, her eyes were dry. Her voice was steady. She had decided somewhere in the 20 seconds she'd needed that she was not going to fall apart in front of this man over people who did not deserve the power to make her fall apart. "Did you know," she asked, "about the water rights before you wrote to my family?" "No," he said immediately. "I knew the land. I didn't know it was connected to your family in any way. My lawyer handled the purchase before I was on the spread." She nodded. "The letter is going to require a response," he said carefully. "Yes. I'd like to write it together if you're willing." She looked at him. How was standing in the kitchen doorway, this tall, weathered, contained man who had said, "I know the difference." 3 evenings ago, and had meant it, and he was looking at her with the same steady eyes and asking her, not telling her. Asking her if she wanted to stand alongside him in this. She had spent 26 years waiting for someone to ask. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." "Good." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, and between them on the table was the letter from her father, and behind her was the bread she'd been making, and outside was the mountain that didn't know or care about William Harper or water rights or any of it. And something in Evelyn's chest that had been braced for years was bracing differently now, not against the world, not against the people who'd sent her away, against whatever was coming. And whatever was coming, she was not going to face it alone. That was what she hadn't known to want, she realized. Not love, not first. First this. Someone who asked. The letter they wrote together was polite, legal, and absolutely firm. It laid out the history of the land purchase, cited the relevant documentation, and concluded with a single clear sentence that Evelyn drafted herself and Wyatt approved without amendment. "We wish the Harper family well, and we consider this matter closed." She sealed it herself. And when she handed it to Darnell to take to the post, she felt something shift inside her with the finality of a key turning in a lock. She did not know yet that her family was not done. She did not know that the letter she'd just sent would be read in the Harper parlor 3 days later and received not as a conclusion, but as a declaration of war. She did not know that Ruth, who had spent 12 years underestimating her stepdaughter, was about to make the mistake of continuing to do so. What she knew was this: she was standing on a mountain in a life she was building with her own hands, beside a man who had looked at her and seen something worth knowing. And for the first time in 26 years, she felt the ground solid beneath her feet. The reply from Millhaven came 11 days later. Not a letter this time. People. Evelyn was in the root cellar when she heard the wagon pull into the yard. The particular sound of wheels on the frozen ground. The creak of the brake being set, voices she recognized before she'd even climbed the steps. She stood at the top of the cellar stairs with a jar of preserved tomatoes in each hand and watched the Harper family climb down from a hired wagon like they were arriving for a social call. Ruth, first in her good traveling coat, scanning the yard with the expression of someone assessing property. Clara behind her, prettier than Evelyn remembered and entirely aware of it. Her eyes moving over the ranch buildings with a calculating interest she didn't bother to disguise. And last, her father, William Harper, thinner than she remembered, his hat in his hands, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. Evelyn set the jars down on the top step. She had 11 seconds before Ruth saw her. She used them to decide something important. She was not going to be the frightened girl who had left Millhaven with an old travel bag and nothing left to lose. She had not been that girl for some time. She was done pretending otherwise. She walked toward them. Ruth saw her first. Something moved across her stepmother's face. Surprise quickly controlled, and underneath the surprise, something that looked almost like reassessment. As if the woman walking toward her was not entirely what she had expected to find. Good, Evelyn thought. Let her reassess. "Ruth," she said. "Father, Clara." She said each name plainly, without warmth and without hostility, the way you state facts. "I didn't know you were coming." "We wrote," Ruth said. "You wrote to my husband," Evelyn said. "That's different." Ruth's jaw tightened slightly. "Where is Mr. Callahan?" "He's working. I'll let him know you're here." She paused. "Why are you here?" "Family visit," Ruth said smoothly. "We didn't have family visits when I lived in your house," Evelyn said. "Try again." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of someone who had expected to walk into a familiar dynamic and found the furniture rearranged. Her father cleared his throat. "Evelyn, we've come a long way. Could we go inside?" She looked at him. At the man who had sat in a chair and looked out a window while his wife arranged her away like surplus goods. He was looking at her directly now, which was more than he'd managed on the morning she'd left, and she could see in his face something she hadn't expected. Not guilt exactly, but the shadow of it. The expression of a man who had made a series of decisions and was standing now in their consequences and finding them uncomfortable. She didn't soften. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." She sent Pete to find Wyatt before she'd even put the pot on. She didn't ask Pete to hurry. She used her normal voice and her normal words because she refused to let Ruth see her scramble. But she felt under the surface of her calm the precise and urgent need for Wyatt to be in this room. Not because she needed saving. She wanted to be clear about that even in her own mind. She did not need saving. But she needed a witness. She needed someone in this room who knew what she was, who had looked at her and said, I know the difference, so that when Ruth began doing what Ruth always did, chipping away, reframing, rearranging the narrative until Evelyn appeared small inside it, there was someone present who already knew the truth. Ruth was doing a slow, deliberate inventory of the kitchen when Wyatt came in. He came directly still in his work coat, and he read the room in the time it took him to cross it. The three Harpers arranged at the table, Evelyn at the stove, the particular texture of the silence, and he came to stand not in front of Evelyn, but beside her. Not in a protective way that suggested she couldn't handle herself. In the way of a man indicating clearly, and without drama, which side of the room he was on. Mr. Harper, he said, extending his hand to her father. Mrs. Harper. A nod to Ruth, not a handshake. Miss Harper, to Clara. Mr. Callahan. Ruth's voice was at its most gracious, the voice she used when she wanted something. We're so glad to finally meet you in person. We've been worried about Evelyn's adjustment, of course. It's quite a change from what she's accustomed to. She's adjusted fine, Wyatt said. Ruth smiled with all her teeth. Yes, I can see she's made herself very at home, though I imagine there are challenges with a woman of Evelyn's particular temperament. Her temperament suits this place, Wyatt said. Flat, final, the tone of a man closing a door. Ruth blinked. She had not expected flat. She had expected a man who could be worked, who could be flattered into alliance. She recalibrated, visibly turning toward Evelyn with an expression of warm concern that Evelyn recognized the way you recognize a knife even when it's pointed away from you. Darling, you look well, Ruth said. The mountain air agrees with you. Yes, Evelyn said. It does. She poured coffee and set it on the table and sat down, and Wyatt sat beside her, and the five of them looked at each other across the table. We should talk about why you've come, Evelyn said. Can't a family visit their daughter? Clara said from her end of the table. She was looking at Wyatt with the particular attention she gave to men she found interesting, and it was the most transparent thing Evelyn had seen in years. You can, Evelyn said. You haven't. So tell me what you actually want. Ruth set down her coffee cup. The warmth dropped out of her expression, the way a lamp drops out when the oil runs dry. What was underneath it was harder and more honest, the Ruth that Evelyn had spent 12 years learning to read. The water rights, Ruth said. No, Evelyn said. Evelyn. That land was sold. The sale was legal. We've already communicated that clearly. The answer is no. Your mother. Don't. The word came out of Evelyn like something struck from iron. Don't use my mother. My mother has been dead for 14 years. She has nothing to do with a land sale my father handled when I was 4 years old. Her father flinched. Ruth pressed forward. The water access on that section of creek is worth considerable money. You may not understand the full extent of what— I understand numbers, Evelyn said. I kept your household accounts for 8 years. I understand what that water access is worth, and I understand that it belongs to this ranch, and I understand that the only reason you're sitting in my kitchen right now is because you decided that sending me up here gave you a way to get at it. She stopped. So that's what I want to know. Whose idea was it? Was it yours, Ruth? Or did my father actually come up with this one himself? The silence was absolute. Clara was no longer looking at Wyatt. Her father's hands flat on the table moved slightly, a small helpless gesture that she recognized. The gesture of a man who wants to disappear. William, Ruth said sharply. He looked up. At Evelyn. Not at Ruth. At Evelyn. It was both of us, he said. Ruth made a sound. It was both of us. William Harper said again, and his voice was quiet and exhausted, and she could hear in it the particular fatigue of a man who had been making the wrong choices for so long he'd forgotten what the right ones felt like. We knew about the water access. We'd known for a while. There's a mining operation coming into the territory, and the creek water is the value is significant. When the opportunity arose to place you in this position, we thought, "You thought I was a card to play," Evelyn said. He closed his eyes briefly. "We thought you might benefit as well. You'd have a husband, a home." "You thought I was worthless enough that I'd be grateful," she said. "You thought that sending me away with a description of everything I wasn't to a stranger who was told I could work. You thought I'd be so desperate to have anyone want me that I'd be useful to you without asking questions." The kitchen was very still. Wyatt's hand on the table beside hers moved approximately 1 inch closer. She felt it without looking at it. "You were wrong," she said. "About all of it." Ruth had been very quiet for the last 60 seconds, which was unusual enough that Evelyn tracked it. She was watching Ruth the way you watch weather, knowing it was building toward something. "Mr. Callahan," Ruth said, pivoting with the smoothness of someone who'd lost one angle and was finding another. "I think you should understand something about your wife. Evelyn has always had a tendency to overreach. It's a pattern in her. She inserts herself into situations that aren't her concern. She takes liberties she hasn't been granted. I wonder if she's been entirely transparent with you about the nature of her role in your household. Whether she's represented herself accurately." Wyatt looked at Ruth for a long moment. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to stop you there." Ruth stopped. "I've known my wife for 2 months," he said. "In that time she found a theft in my accounts that's been running for over a year. Repaired the organization of this household. Identified a drainage problem that would have cost me a significant loss before winter, and managed every challenge this ranch has put in front of her with more competence and steadiness than most men I've hired." He paused. "So when you tell me she overreaches, I'm not sure what you mean by that. She does the work in front of her. That's not overreach, that's character." Clara was looking at Wyatt now with an entirely different expression, less calculating, more startled, as if she had just seen something she hadn't expected. Ruth's face had gone very still. "Furthermore," Wyatt said, and his voice hadn't risen a single degree, which made it somehow more formidable. "You're sitting in my house, you're sitting at my wife's table, and you're attempting to convince me that my wife is the problem here." He looked at Ruth without expression. "I think you might want to take some time and consider what that looks like from where I'm sitting." William Harper made a sound that might have been a cough, or might have been something else entirely. "We should go," he said to Ruth. "William, we should go." He pushed back his chair. He looked at Evelyn, and there was something in his face that she hadn't seen in a very long time. Not since she was small, not since before Ruth, not since the years when he had occasionally remembered that he had a daughter who needed him. It was the look of a man who was ashamed of himself. It would have meant more to her 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It meant something now. She was surprised to find that it did, but it meant something differently. It was a door that had been shut for so long that the weight of it had become structural. Opening it now wouldn't change what had been built around it. "Evelyn," he said. "Father," she said. A pause. He put on his hat. "You look well," he said. "I mean that." "I know," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and moved toward the door. Ruth stood, and there was a moment, one precise, dangerous moment, where Ruth looked at Evelyn across the kitchen with an expression Evelyn had never seen on her before. Not anger. Not the comfortable contempt that Evelyn had grown up beneath. Something colder and more honest. The look of a woman who had underestimated someone and knew it and would not forget it. Evelyn held the look. "Goodbye, Ruth," she said. Ruth said nothing. She turned and followed William out the door. Clara lingered for 3 seconds longer than necessary, looking at Wyatt one more time with an expression that was hard to interpret, and then she said, not to Ruth, not to their father, but to Evelyn directly, "The kitchen is nicer than I expected." Then she was gone too. The sound of the wagon pulling out of the yard was the loudest thing Evelyn had heard in months. She and Wyatt sat at the kitchen table without speaking for a long moment. The coffee cups were still on the table. The fire was still going. Outside, the wagon was rolling back down the mountain road. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You sure?" She considered the question honestly. Was she all right? Her father had just confirmed what she'd suspected, that she had been used. That the marriage, the arrangement, the careful language in that letter, describing her as functional but plain, all of it had been calculated. She had been moved like a piece on a board by people who had also spent years telling her she wasn't worth much. "I'm angry," she said, "but I'm all right." "Good," he said. "Angry is appropriate." "I was ashamed of himself," she said. "My father, I could see it." "Yes," Wyatt said. "It doesn't fix anything," she said. "But I saw it." He nodded. She looked at the table. "You didn't have to say what you said to Ruth." "I know." "No," he said. "You chose to." "Yes." She looked at him. "Why?" And Wyatt Callahan turned his cup in his hands. That gesture she'd come to know, the thinking gesture, the words, our coming gesture, and said, "Because it was true, and because she was using your history against you, and because I don't stand by and watch that happen to people who don't deserve it." He paused. "Especially not in my own house." Especially not in my own house. She heard what was in that, the weight of it, the claiming quality of it, the particular way a man says "my house" when he means something more than the building. "Thank you," she said quietly. He shook his head slightly. "Don't thank me for telling the truth." She almost smiled. "All right," she said. "I won't." They sat in the kitchen until the coffee went cold, and neither of them moved to freshen it, and neither of them spoke much more. But the silence between them was the kind of silence that has content, that is full of things recently said, and recently heard, and recently understood, settling into new configurations, finding their places in the architecture of what was being built. She thought she should feel worse than she did. She thought the confirmation of what her family had done, the deliberateness of it, the calculation should hit harder than it was hitting. And maybe it would later in the dark, in the way that things you hold together during the day sometimes come apart at night. Maybe she would feel it then. But right now, sitting at this table in this kitchen on this mountain, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel in the aftermath of that conversation. She felt solid, not happy, not relieved, solid, rooted, like something that had been loose in her for years had been pressed down and set. She knew who she was. She had always known somewhere under everything. But now she knew it in a way that had been tested, that had stood in a room with the people who'd spent years telling her she was something lesser, and had not moved, had not apologized, had not shrunk. Harper Callahan. And she was done being small for other people's comfort. 3 days after the Harpers left, the second blow arrived, and this one came from a direction she hadn't been watching. Darnell brought the news in from town, the way news always arrived on the mountain through the back door, and with a particular reluctance in the way the messenger held himself. He came to find Wyatt first, which was protocol, but Wyatt was in the far pasture, and Darnell found Evelyn in the kitchen instead, and he stood in the doorway turning his hat in his hands with an expression that told her it was bad before he said a word. "There's talk in Ridgefall," he said. "Bad kind." "Tell me," she said. He told her. Ruth, it turned out, had not left the mountain quietly. On her way back through Ridgefall, a stop she'd made without Evelyn's knowledge, a stop at Finch's Mercantile where she'd had a conversation with Dorothy Price, who happened to be there. Ruth had spoken at some length about Evelyn, about the nature of the arrangement, about the fact that Evelyn had come to the Callahan spread under, as Ruth had phrased it, somewhat misleading circumstances, that Evelyn had represented herself as something she was not, that there were things about Evelyn's character and history that the mountain community would want to know. She hadn't said anything specific enough to be called a lie. Ruth was too smart for that. She'd said enough to plant the question, said enough to make people wonder, said enough to make Dorothy Price, who'd been looking for an angle on Evelyn since the first day in the Mercantile, feel like she finally had the shape of the thing she'd been suspicious of all along. By the time Darnell came back to the ranch, it had been 24 hours, and the story had traveled the valley. "How bad?" Evelyn asked. Darnell turned his hat. "Bad enough that old Morrison from the lower ranch sent a rider up yesterday to warn Mr. Callahan. He said he wanted Mr. Callahan to know he didn't believe it, but he wanted him to know it was out there." "Morrison," she said. "That's the man Wyatt's negotiating the water rights dispute with." "Yes, ma'am." She understood immediately. The water rights dispute, the legal fight Wyatt had mentioned on one of their kitchen evenings, was in a fragile stage. Morrison was a potential ally. If Morrison began to doubt Wyatt's judgment, if he began to wonder about the woman Wyatt had brought onto his spread, if he decided that the Callahan household was unstable or compromised, it could undo months of careful work. Ruth had been strategic. That was what Evelyn had underestimated. She'd thought her stepmother was simply wounded pride and cold anger coming to the ranch and finding that her piece had moved off the board she'd planned. She hadn't fully accounted for the intelligence behind the anger. Ruth did not make mistakes without also making them count for something. She'd come to the ranch and lost, so on her way out, she'd burned the ground. "Where's Wyatt?" Evelyn said. "I'll get him," Darnell said. "Thank you." He left at a near run. She stood in the kitchen alone for the 4 minutes it took Wyatt to come in from the pasture. She used those 4 minutes to think very carefully because the next conversation was going to matter, and she needed to enter it, having already done the work of her own emotion, the anger, the humiliation, the particular sick feeling of knowing that Ruth had managed even in defeat to reach back and cause damage. She was done with those feelings by the time she heard his boots on the step. He came in and looked at her, and she could see that Darnell had told him on the way, because his jaw was set in a way she'd learned to recognize. "You heard," she said. "I heard." "Morrison sent a rider," she said. "I know. Morrison's a fair man. He's not going to let this change his position without talking to me directly." "But it might," she said. "If this keeps moving. If Dorothy Price adds to it, if Ruth has sent anything in writing." "Evelyn." He stopped her. Not with his hands. With his voice steady the way it always was, the steadiness that she'd come to use like a reference point, the way sailors use a fixed star. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly." "I'm listening," she said. "Whatever your family does," he said. "Whatever this valley says. Whatever Dorothy Price decides to involve herself in. I know what I know about you. 2 months on this ranch has shown me exactly who you are, and I am not going to be moved off that by a woman who spent 20 minutes in a mercantile." She looked at him. "But it can hurt the ranch," she said. "It can hurt your negotiations with Morrison. You worked toward that for 3 years. I won't let my family cost you 3 years of work." "Then help me fix it," he said. "Don't tell me to stand aside and let you handle the damage alone. We're not doing this separately." The word we landed with a particular weight. She felt it in her chest. "All right," she said. "Then we need to go to Morrison directly. Before this goes further, we need to get in front of it." He was already nodding. "Tomorrow morning." "I want to come," she said. He looked at her. "I know you do." "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes, Evelyn." The ride to the Morrison spread. The following morning was long and cold, the sky low and gray with the particular heaviness of a late-season system building over the peaks. They rode mostly in silence, but it was a working silence, both of them thinking through what needed to be said, how to say it, what the next hour required. Evelyn had met Garrett Morrison once briefly at Finch's Mercantile before any of this had started. He was a big man, rangy and deliberate in his 60s, with the kind of stillness that meant he'd seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. He was the kind of man who made up his mind slowly and held to it stubbornly, which meant that getting in front of this today was the only chance they were going to get. Morrison himself met them in the yard. He shook Wyatt's hand. He looked at Evelyn with a careful, measuring look, not hostile careful. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. He tipped his hat. "I expected you'd come." "I imagine you did," she said. Inside, Morrison's wife made coffee and left them alone at the table, which was either a sign of trust or a sign that she'd been asked to, and either way, Evelyn appreciated it. Morrison put his hands on the table. "I'll be direct, Callahan. You know that's my way." "I know it," Wyatt said. "The woman who came through town, your wife's stepmother, she said some things. I'm not one to put stock in gossip. But the water rights negotiation is a significant matter, and I've got neighbors who are asking questions, and I need to look them in the eye with confidence when I tell them the Callahan arrangement is solid." "It's solid," Wyatt said. "Tell me," Morrison said. Not to Wyatt, to Evelyn. "Tell me what I need to know." She had expected this. She had spent the ride preparing for exactly this. She told him. Not everything, not the private shape of her marriage, Not the kitchen table conversations. Not the things between herself and Wyatt that weren't anyone else's business. But the rest of it. Her family's scheme with the water rights. The letter. The visit to the ranch. The conversation in Ruth's own words, her father's confession, the calculation behind the arrangement. She told it plainly, in order, without embellishment and without self-pity. The way you lay out, here is what happened, here is the evidence, here is what it means. Morrison listened. He didn't interrupt. He sat with his hands on this table and his eyes on her face, and he listened the way a fair man listens fully, without deciding before she'd finished. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Your family sent you here as a play for the water access," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you didn't know that when you came?" "No, I thought they were disposing of me." She paused. "In hindsight, I prefer the first interpretation. At least it suggests they thought I was useful for something." Morrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. It was a real laugh, brief. Dry, the laugh of a man who has heard 1,000 kinds of human foolishness and still finds the particular variety mildly astonishing. "Lord Almighty," he said, "your family sent you up here to work a land scheme, and instead you found the accounts fraud, fixed the root cellar, and reorganized the household." "Yes," she said. "And your stepmother came to your kitchen to try to undermine you." "Yes." "And you threw them out." "Politely," she said. "But yes." Morrison looked at Wyatt. "Where'd you find her?" "She found me," Wyatt said. "More or less." Morrison sat back in his chair. Something in his expression had shifted, the caution still present, but the suspicion behind it gone, replaced by something warmer and more straightforward. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "I'm going to tell my neighbors that the situation has been explained to my satisfaction. I'll also be telling Dorothy Price, who I've known for 30 years to be a woman who enjoys a problem more than a solution, that she's done enough." He paused. "The water rights negotiation will proceed as planned." Evelyn let out a breath she'd been holding since the previous morning. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "You told me the truth. That's all I needed." He looked at her steadily. "You come from hard country, Mrs. Callahan. Not the mountain kind. The harder kind." "Yes," she said. "I do." "You'll do fine up here," he said. "Country like this has a way of recognizing its own." She held his gaze. "I'm beginning to think you might be right." The ride back was different from the ride out. The cloud cover was breaking slightly to the west, and there was a slant of cold afternoon light coming through in a way that made the mountain faces on the far side of the valley look sharp and clean and very near. They rode at a pace that was unhurried, and for a while neither of them spoke, and then Wyatt said, "You were right about going. I would have gone alone, and it wouldn't have been the same." "I know," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You're allowed to just say thank you." "You told me not to thank you for telling the truth," she said. "I'm taking the same position." Something happened at the corner of his mouth that was as close to a full smile as she'd seen on him. She looked away before she responded to it in any way she'd have to account for later. They were nearly back to the ranch road when she said, because the day had shaken things loose that needed saying. Because she had learned here that the plain truth was always better than the careful version, "I'm not leaving." He looked at her. "I want you to know that," she said. "Whatever my family does next, whatever comes from this, I'm not leaving this place." He was quiet for 3 long seconds. "Good," he said. One word. But in his voice was the entire weight of a man who had once watched someone leave and had spent years learning to live with what that felt like, saying plainly, without drama, in the way he said everything that mattered, that this time was different, that she was different. She faced forward and held the reins and let the mountain cold touch her face, and behind her eyes she felt something she did not have a clean word for. Not yet, not quite, but coming. Building the way, storms built over the peaks slowly and then all at once. She was not finished being tested. She would understand that before the week was out. Because that night after supper, after the fire and the coffee and the quiet, after Wyatt had said good night, and she had sat alone for a while with her thoughts, she found something. It was in the pocket of her travel coat, the coat she'd arrived in, the coat she hadn't worn since the first weeks hanging by the door. She'd put it on against the cold when she'd gone to check on something in the yard, and in the deep inside pocket, her fingers found paper. She pulled it out. A letter. Not new, weeks old, folded small. She recognized the handwriting on the outside immediately, Clara's. She stood very still in the cold yard and unfolded it. It was short. 6 lines. Written before the visit, she could tell from the date at the top, written the week before the Harpers had arrived. Evelyn, I know you won't believe this from me, but Ruth has contacted a man named Aldous Price, Dorothy Price's brother-in-law. He's a lawyer out of Denver. She isn't done with the water rights. She has documents she says prove the original sale was coerced. I don't know if that's true. I don't know what she'll do with them. I thought you should know. See, Evelyn read it twice. Then she looked up at the dark mountain above her. Aldous Price, a lawyer in Denver. Documents claiming the sale was coerced. Ruth hadn't come to the ranch to negotiate. She'd come to see the territory before she sent in someone who knew how to fight on paper. The visit had been reconnaissance, and they had been so focused on winning that confrontation that they hadn't seen the real battle assembling behind it. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her dress pocket. She went back inside. She went to Wyatt's door and knocked. He opened it, still dressed, a book in his hand, which told her he'd been reading rather than sleeping. He took one look at her face. What happened? He said. She held out the letter. He read it. She watched his expression do what it rarely did, shift. Tighten. The stillness breaking for just a moment into something harder and more urgent underneath. How long has this been in your coat? He said. Clara must have put it there during the visit. I don't know when exactly. I didn't find it until tonight. He looked up from the letter. His eyes were very steady and very serious. We need to ride to Denver, he said. I know, she said. We need to talk to my lawyer before Price gets there. I know, she said again. He looked at her, this woman standing in his doorway in the mountain dark, who had come to him as a stranger and had become in the space of 2 months the person he trusted most in the world, who had just found a letter that could mean a serious legal fight over land that was rightfully his, and who was standing in front of him, not frightened, not collapsing, but clear-eyed and ready. You're not afraid, he said. I'm furious, she said. It's different. For the first time since she had arrived at the Callahan spread. Wyatt reached out and put his hand against her face, a brief, careful gesture, his rough palm against her cheek. The touch of a man who had something to say that was too large for words and was trying to say a fraction of it this way. She went absolutely still. He dropped his hand. We leave at first light, he said. I'll be ready, she said. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and pressed the place on her cheek where his hand had been, and she breathed, and she told herself to be sensible, to be practical, to focus on what was in front of them. But her heart was doing something it hadn't done in years, maybe ever. And the mountain night was very large around her, and for the first time she understood that what she stood to lose here was not just a ranch, not just a legal fight, not just the life she was building. She stood to lose the first place that had ever felt like it was actually hers. And she would burn the world to the ground before she let Ruth Harper take it from her. They rode out before the sun was fully up. Wyatt had arranged for Hector to manage the ranch in their absence, 2 days to Denver, 2 days back. However long the business with his lawyer required in between. He'd said nothing to the hands about why they were going. He told Hector there was a legal matter that needed addressing, and Hector had nodded in the way of a man who understood that some information wasn't his to have. Evelyn packed one bag. Light. She was getting good at that. The first hour of the ride was cold and silent, and she spent it with Clara's letter folded in her dress pocket and her mind moving through what she knew, what she didn't know, and what she needed to find out. Wyatt rode beside her, not ahead, which she'd noticed he always did. Now, not the first week when she'd followed Darnell up the mountain like a piece of luggage being delivered, but now. He rode beside her. She thought about Ruth. About the particular species of intelligence Ruth possessed. Not warm intelligence, not the kind that made you good company, but the cold, patient, strategic kind that knew how to wait and how to place and how to set things in motion, and then stepped back and let them move. She thought about the visit to the ranch and saw it differently now through the lens of Clara's letter. Ruth hadn't come to negotiate. She'd come to look at the ground, to walk through the house to see Wyatt and measure him, to determine exactly what she was dealing with before she sent Aldous Price in with the paperwork. And she'd done it with Evelyn's own father in tow, using him the way she used everything as a prop. A face that softened the appearance of the thing she was actually doing. "You've been thinking hard since we left," Wyatt said. "Yes," she said. "Want to tell me what you've worked out?" she told him. Everything she'd turned over in the pre-dawn quiet while she was packing the shape of Ruth's strategy as she now understood it, the way the visit had functioned, the timeline that Clara's letter implied. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to rely on the way he gave information the full space it needed before he responded to it. "The documents she claims to have," he said when she finished. "Claiming the original sale was coerced. That's the part I need my lawyer to see first." "Yes, because if she's actually found something or manufactured something that creates the appearance of coercion, the water rights become a legal dispute rather than a clear title. And a legal dispute is expensive and slow and uncertain, which is exactly the kind of uncertainty that could affect the Morrison negotiation. She's not fighting to win," Wyatt said slowly. "She's fighting to create enough mess that I settle." "Yes," Evelyn said. "That's exactly right. She doesn't need to win. She needs the fight to be costly enough that you decide the water access is worth less than the trouble of holding it." He was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't know me very well." "No," Evelyn said. "She doesn't." There was something in his voice when he said that, a quiet, unmovable certainty that she found in spite of everything steadying. He was not a man who settled because a thing became difficult. She'd understood that about him early. It was in the way he'd handled Garver, the way he'd handled Morrison, the way he'd sat across from Ruth in his own kitchen and closed every door she'd tried to open without raising his voice once. "My lawyer's name is Harlan Pruitt," he said. "He's been practicing in Denver for 20 years. He handled the original purchase. If anyone can find what Ruth is working from, it's Pruitt." "Good," she said. They rode. The sky ahead of them was clearing, which Evelyn took as neither a good omen nor a bad one. Just weather doing what weather did, indifferent as the mountain. Denver in late November was a different world from the ranch. Bigger, louder smelling of coal smoke and horses, and the particular collective urgency of a city that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. Evelyn had been to Denver twice in her life, both times with her father on supply runs when she was young, and both times she'd found it overwhelming in a way she hadn't had the vocabulary to describe at the time. Now she had the vocabulary. It was the feeling of a place that demanded you move at its pace rather than your own. Wyatt moved through it like he moved through everything without hurrying, without being hurried. Harlan Pruitt's office was on the second floor of a building near the courthouse, up a narrow staircase that creaked under Wyatt's boots. Pruitt himself was a compact, silver-haired man in his late 50s, with the sharp, watchful eyes of someone who had spent decades reading rooms and people simultaneously. He shook Wyatt's hand and then turned to Evelyn with a look that assessed and categorized quickly without rudeness. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "I've heard you've had an interesting few months." "That's one word for it," she said. He smiled briefly. "Wyatt sent me 2 letters since October. You feature prominently in both." She glanced at Wyatt. He was looking at the wall. "Sit down," Pruitt said. "Tell me everything," she told him. Between herself and Wyatt, they laid out the full picture, the original letter from her father, the visit, Clara's warning. Aldous Price, the claim documents. Pruitt listened with a stillness that reminded her of Wyatt, the stillness of someone whose listening was itself a form of work. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Aldous Price," he said. "You know him?" Wyatt asked. "I know of him. He practices out of Denver, yes. He's not without skill." Pruitt tapped one finger on his desk. "The claim of coercion in the original sale is interesting. It's also almost certainly fabricated, because I handled that purchase myself, and there was nothing coercive about it. The seller was a man named George Aldridge, who wanted to liquidate quickly because he was moving his family to California. He was offered fair price. He accepted fair price. He signed. I witnessed it." He paused. "What concerns me is not whether they can prove coercion. They can't. What concerns me is whether they have something that looks like they might be able to." "Explain that," Evelyn said. Pruitt looked at her. "There's a category of legal maneuvering that doesn't require you to win. It requires you to produce enough documentation, real forged, or simply taken out of context, to create the appearance of a genuine dispute. Then you file. The filing creates a cloud on the title. The cloud on the title creates uncertainty. Uncertainty makes lenders nervous, makes neighbors nervous, makes anyone in the middle of a negotiation." He glanced at Wyatt. "Say a water rights negotiation want to wait until the cloud clears." "Which takes how long?" Evelyn asked. "Months, sometimes more than a year." The room was quiet. "Is there a way to get ahead of it?" she asked. "Before they file?" Pruitt looked at her steadily. "Possibly. If we can establish preemptively through affidavits, through documentation of the sale, through testimony from anyone present at the original transaction that the title is clean and the claim has no basis, we create a record that precedes any filing. It doesn't stop them from filing. But it means the filing lands in a context where the defense is already built." "George Aldridge," Wyatt said. "The original seller. Do you know where he is?" "California last I heard. San Francisco." "Can you find him?" "I can try." "Find him," Wyatt said. "Whatever it costs." Pruitt nodded. He turned to Evelyn. "There's something else I'd like to ask you about Mrs. Callahan, if you're willing." "Go ahead," she said. "Your mother's family, the original connection to this land. Your stepmother is presumably using that connection to argue that the land should have remained in the Harper family line, that selling it was against your mother's wishes or interests. Do you know anything about your mother's feelings about the land?" Evelyn was still. "My mother died when I was 12, she said carefully. "She didn't talk to me about land. She talked to me about—" She stopped. Something was moving in her memory, shifting toward the surface. "She kept letters," she said slowly. "My mother kept everything. All her correspondence, all her documents. She was meticulous about paper. When she died, the papers went to my father." "And your father," Pruitt said, "would have given them to Ruth," she said. "Eventually, when he stopped being the one who managed things, and Ruth became the one who managed things." Pruitt and Wyatt were both very still. "If your mother wrote anything about the land," Pruitt said carefully, "about her intentions regarding it, about whether she wanted it sold or retained, Ruth may have those letters. She may be planning to use them, or she may have already altered them," Evelyn said quietly, "to say what she needs them to say." "That's forgery," Pruitt said. "Ruth is careful," Evelyn said. "She doesn't leave obvious tracks." "Everyone leaves tracks," Pruitt said. "That's what 20 years of law practice has taught me. Everyone leaves tracks." He stood. "Give me 3 days. I'll pull everything I have on the original transaction. I'll send a wire to San Francisco about Aldridge, and I'll do some quiet inquiry about what Price has filed or is preparing to file." He looked at Wyatt. "Where are you staying?" Wyatt named the hotel. "I'll send word when I have something." He extended his hand to Evelyn. "Mrs. Callahan, I understand this has been—" "It's been a lot," she said. "Yes," he said. "It has. You've handled it well from what I can see." "I've handled it," she said. "Whether well remains to be determined." Pruitt smiled again, a real smile this time with something warm in it. "I think you'll find it was well," he said. "Give it time." The hotel Wyatt had chosen was decent and plain. 2 rooms side by side on the 2nd floor, and after the long ride and the meeting with Pruitt, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed in her room and felt the accumulated weight of the last weeks pressed down on her all at once. Not breaking, she wasn't breaking, but heavy. The specific heaviness of someone who has been holding a great deal together for a long time and has briefly stopped moving. She heard Wyatt moving in the room next to hers, the sound of his boots, the creak of the chair, and then silence, which meant he was doing what he did when he had things to think through, sitting still and thinking them through. She wanted suddenly, and with a clarity that surprised her, to go knock on his door. Not about the legal situation, not about Pruitt or Ruth or the water rights. Just to sit with him, In the same room. In the quiet, the way they sat in the kitchen on the ranch in the evenings, when there was nothing that needed saying, and they said nothing, and it was enough. She didn't knock. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling, and thought about what Pruitt had said. Your mother's letters. Her mother, who had been meticulous about paper. Evelyn remembered that, remembered her mother at the writing desk in the corner of the sitting room. The particular sound of the pen, the careful way she folded and sealed things. She remembered the wooden box her mother kept correspondence in, the way it smelled of cedar and ink. She had not thought about that box in years. She thought about it now, and something else came with it. A memory she hadn't accessed in a long time, specific and sudden, the kind of memory that arrives with the full sensory weight of the moment it's from. She was 11 years old. Her mother was ill, but not yet dying ill in the way that looked like it might still reverse. And her mother had called her into the bedroom and sat her down and said, Evelyn, I want you to know that the land that came from my family, the Creek land, I want it to go to you. Not to be sold, not to be managed by anyone else. To you directly when the time comes. Your father knows this. She sat up in bed. Your father knows this. She hadn't thought about that conversation since she was 12 years old. Hadn't needed to. It had been stored in some back room of her memory, with the other things too painful to visit regularly. Her father knew. He had known when he sold that land that her mother had wanted it to go to Evelyn directly, not to be sold. Certainly not to be absorbed into a property transaction that had nothing to do with her mother's family, and Ruth. If Ruth had gone through her mother's papers, Ruth would know too. Ruth wasn't planning to use forged letters. She was planning to use the real ones. The letters where her mother had stated in her own careful hand that the Creek land was meant for Evelyn. Not to claim the land for the Harper family, to claim it for Evelyn, and then use Evelyn's relationship to the Callahan property to argue that the land had been improperly removed from her inheritance and should be restored with compensation too. And this was the part that made Evelyn's hands go cold to the Harper family, who were her nearest kin and would administer it on her behalf. They weren't stealing from Wyatt. They were stealing from Evelyn, and they were doing it in Evelyn's name. She was at Wyatt's door before she'd consciously decided to move. She knocked. He opened it immediately, still dressed, and took one look at her face. Come in, he said. She came in. She sat in the chair by the window and told him what she'd remembered and what she'd understood from it. And he listened, standing up, his arms crossed, his expression doing the thing it did when information was rearranging itself inside him. When she finished, he said, They're going to argue that the land is yours by inheritance, that it was wrongfully sold, that as your husband, I've benefited from a wrong done to you. And they're going to appoint themselves as what? Your representatives, your advocates. My family, she said. Acting in my interests. That's how they'll frame it. While also being the people who sent you up here as a land play, he said flatly. Yes, the same people who described you to me as functional but plain. Yes, she said. He shook his head, a small, sharp motion. That is the most. He stopped, started again. We need to tell Pruitt tomorrow morning, first thing. Yes, and I need to think about whether I can remember anything else my mother said, anything that might tell us the specific contents of what she wrote. All right. He paused. Evelyn. Yes. Are you all right? She thought about this, truly thought about it. Was she all right? Her mother's memory had just been turned into a legal instrument by people who had never particularly respected her mother while she was alive. Her father had sold land he knew should have gone to her. She was sitting in a hotel room in Denver, fighting a battle she hadn't started and couldn't have anticipated. I'm angry, she said. Again. Good, he said. Again. She almost smiled. He pulled the room's second chair closer and sat in it, not across from her, not at the table's distance that they used on the ranch, but closer. The way people sit when the situation has stripped away the protocols, and what's left is two people who need to be near each other. Tell me about your mother, he said. She looked at him. Why? Because you might remember something useful. And because... He paused. Because it seems like something you haven't been able to do in a long time. With someone who wanted to hear it. She was very still for a moment. Then she began to talk. Her mother's name had been Anne. Anne Hargrove before she'd married William Harper, and she'd always been more Hargrove than Harper, more her own people, the people who'd built and worked and held their land through generations, than anything she'd become through marriage. She'd been warm and precise in equal measure, the way some women are warm without being soft with a sense of humor. She deployed quietly, and an opinion she stated without apology. She'd loved the land. The specific land, the creek, the water, the way the light came in off the mountain in the mornings. She'd talked about it the way some people talk about a living thing. Evelyn talked for almost an hour. Wyatt listened. At the end of it, she realized her eyes were wet, which she hadn't anticipated, and she looked away and pressed her fingers briefly to her eyes and said, "I haven't talked about her in years." "I know," he said. "I could tell." "She would have liked this," she said. "The ranch, the mountain. She would have understood it immediately." "She would have liked you," he said. "The woman you've become. I think she'd have found that satisfying." Evelyn looked at him. "You didn't know her," she said. "No," he said. "But I know you. And I know what it takes to become someone like you starting from what you started from. She had something to do with that." He paused. I think she'd want to know it took." The room was very quiet. Outside Denver made its city sounds distant, busy, indifferent. In here there was just the two of them, and the lamp and the chairs pulled close, and the truth of what had just been said lying between them like something set down gently. "Wyatt," she said. "Yes. I need to ask you something." "Ask." "When this is over, when Pruitt does what he does, and the legal matter settles one way or another, what happens to this?" She gestured slightly between them. "What happens to us?" He looked at her steadily. "What do you want to happen?" he said. "I asked you first," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the thinking quiet, the real kind. She waited because she'd learned that rushing him produced nothing, and waiting him out produced the truth. "I want," he said carefully, "what we already have, and then more of it. I want to keep having conversations in the kitchen. I want to keep riding out together. I want to keep—" He stopped. "I want what's been building since you arrived, Evelyn. I'm not subtle enough to describe it better than that. But I know what it is, and I know it's real, and I know I don't want it to stop." She pressed her hands flat on her thighs. Old habit. Steadying. "I'm not easy," she said. "I have opinions. I'll disagree with you. I'll find the problems before you do because I'm always looking for the problems. I'm not. I know what I'm not. I know I'm not what men usually—" "Stop," he said. She stopped. "I know who you are," he said. "I've known for 6 weeks. I'm not asking for something different. I'm asking for exactly what's been happening." He met her eyes. "Unless you don't want that." "I want it," she said, and her voice was steady and clear because she'd decided she was done being careful with this. Being careful with things you wanted had cost her 26 years. "I want it very much." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture. Not the gesture of a man performing something. The quiet, certain gesture of a man who has made a decision and is communicating it without words, the way he communicated most things that mattered to him. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while in the hotel room in Denver, while the legal battle assembled itself around them, and the mountain waited 3 days north, and the fire that had been building quietly for months settled into something she finally let herself name. In the morning, they went back to Pruitt. And the morning brought the first thing Evelyn hadn't seen coming. Pruitt was at his desk when they arrived earlier than they'd agreed, which told her something had happened. He had a stack of papers in front of him and an expression that was controlled but tight around the edges. "Sit down," he said. They sat. "Price filed yesterday afternoon," he said, "before we could get ahead of it." Evelyn heard Wyatt take a breath beside her. He filed a claim asserting that the 1869 sale of the creek land was conducted without proper disclosure to the heirs of the Hargrove estate, specifically without disclosure to Anne Harper, née Hargrove's direct descendants, who had a right of first refusal under a property covenant established by the original Hargrove land grant. The room was very still. "A covenant," Wyatt said. "Yes, Price is arguing that the Hargrove land grant, which is a real document made in 1851, included a covenant requiring that any subsequent sale of creek-adjacent property be offered first to direct Hargrove descendants." Pruitt paused. "The covenant exists. I've verified it. The question is whether it was binding at the time of the 1869 sale, whether proper notification was attempted, and whether the failure to notify, if there was a failure, voids the sale or merely creates a liability." "And what's the answer?" Evelyn asked. "The answer is complicated," Pruitt said. "The covenant's language is ambiguous in ways that will require a judge to interpret. I don't think Price can win a full voiding of the sale. The complications of reversing a 20-year-old property transaction are significant. But he might be able to establish a liability. A monetary claim. Against the Callahan estate in Evelyn's name, payable to her as the Hargrove heir administered by my family," Evelyn said. "Yes." She was quiet. "My mother knew about the covenant," she said. Pruitt looked at her. "That conversation I told you about last night." She glanced at Wyatt, who nodded. "When she said the creek land should come to me, she knew about the covenant. That's why she believed it." She looked at Pruitt. "She wasn't just expressing a wish. She believed there was a legal basis for it." "Yes," Pruitt said. "I think that's right." "Then my father knew too," she said. "When he sold the land, he knew about the covenant, and he sold it anyway." "Yes," Pruitt said. She sat with that for a moment. Her father, who had sat in a chair and looked out windows, who had managed to be present and absent simultaneously for his entire career as her parent, who had somewhere along the way decided that a legal covenant protecting his first wife's legacy for her daughter was less important than whatever financial or personal reason he'd had for making that sale in 1869. "So my family isn't entirely wrong," she said quietly. "About the covenant, it exists. It may have been violated. In technical terms," Pruitt said carefully, "there is an argument to be made, but the remedy they're seeking isn't for me," she said. "They're using my rights to claim money that would go to them. They're making me the instrument of a claim that benefits Ruth." "Yes," Pruitt said. "Then I want to file a counterclaim," she said. "In my own name. Not against Wyatt. There's no claim against Wyatt. We're not doing that. But I want to formally assert that if there is a valid Hargrove covenant, the rights under it belong to me specifically and solely, and cannot be administered by or transferred to or claimed on behalf of the Harper family." Both men were looking at her. "I want to take the weapon out of their hands," she said. "If my mother's covenant is real, it should benefit me, not them. If I formally assert that first, their entire case loses its foundation. They can't act in my name if I've already acted in my own." Pruitt was very still. Then he said, That is an extremely intelligent reading of the situation." "Can we do it?" she asked. "We can do it," he said. He was already reaching for paper. "We can do it today." She looked at Wyatt. I was looking at her with that expression she'd come to know. Not surprise exactly, because she'd noticed he'd stopped being surprised by her some weeks ago. Something else. Something that was warm and steady and private. The expression of a man watching something he already valued demonstrate exactly why he values it. "All right," she said to Pruitt. "Then let's do it today." They spent 4 hours in Pruitt's office. Evelyn sat across the desk and answered every question he asked about her mother, about the conversation. She remembered about anything that might establish her as an independent party with her own standing under the covenant, not as a Harper, not as anyone's dependent, but as Anne Hargrove's daughter, exercising rights that had been hers from the beginning. It was, she thought, the most useful thing she'd ever done with her history. All those years of being Anne Hargrove's plain, oversized, opinionated daughter, the one who didn't fit Ruth's picture, the one no one had chosen. And now here she was, and the one thing that made her irreplaceable in this room, the one thing that gave her standing, that no one else in the world could claim, was being exactly that, Anne Hargrove's daughter. When they came out of Pruitt's office in the late afternoon, the light was already going golden low over the city, And Evelyn stood on the step for a moment, and breathed the cold air, and felt the specific relief of someone who has been fighting uphill and has just found solid ground. Wyatt stood beside her. "You should know," he said, "that when Pruitt read back what you'd outlined, the counterclaim, he looked at me over your head and made a face." She looked at him. What kind of face? The face of a man who is impressed and doesn't quite want to say so directly. "Good," she said. "He's going to tell people about this," Wyatt said. "Lawyers talk. He's going to tell other lawyers about the rancher's wife who walked into his office and dismantled a property claim in an afternoon." "Let him," she said. "I don't mind being talked about when the talking is accurate." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Come on," he said. "I'll buy you supper." She raised an eyebrow. "That's the most festive thing you've said in 2 months." "Don't get used to it," he said. But he was almost smiling, and she was almost smiling, and the city was loud and smoky and indifferent around them, and he offered her his arm, the way men did when they were walking somewhere in public, and she took it, and they walked. It was the first time she'd taken his arm. It felt natural. That was what surprised her. Not momentous, not performed. Just natural, the way things feel when they've been moving toward a particular shape for long enough that arriving there doesn't feel like a surprise. It feels like recognition. "Oh," she thought. This is what this was always going toward." The supper was simple and good, and they talked about things that weren't the legal case about the ranch, about what needed doing before the deep winter set in, about Hector's opinion of the new fence line. Wyatt was planning about whether Pete was old enough to take on more responsibility. Normal things. Ranching things. The things of a life being lived in a specific place with specific people. She realized somewhere in the middle of it that she was happy, not relieved, not satisfied, not the absence of misery, which was the closest she'd come to happiness for most of her adult life, but actually genuinely happy in the way of someone sitting across a table from someone they wanted to be across a table from, talking about the things of their shared life, with somewhere real and specific to go back to when they were done. She sat with that quietly while Wyatt talked about the fence line. She did not say anything about it, but she held it. They returned to the ranch 2 days later with Pruitt's counterclaim filed. Aldridge, located in San Francisco and contacted by wire, and a letter from Pruitt to Aldous Price that Evelyn had not read, but that Wyatt had, and which had made him say briefly that Pruitt was worth every dollar he'd ever been paid. Hector met them in the yard. He looked at their faces and said, "Good trip." "Productive," Wyatt said. Hector nodded. "Morrison sent a rider while you were gone." Evelyn and Wyatt both looked at him. "He wants to proceed with the negotiation," Hector said. "Said to tell you." He pulled out a folded note. "Said to tell you that he'd heard something out of Denver about the Callahan situation, and he found it encouraging." Evelyn looked at Wyatt. "Pruitt," Wyatt said. "Pruitt," she agreed. Hector looked between them. "I don't know what that means, but it seems like good news." "It is," Evelyn said. She walked inside. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it. Her organized shelves, her preserved jars, the accounts book on the table where she'd left it open. The chair where she sat in the evenings, the chair where Wyatt sat across from her. The whole specific, ordinary, irreplaceable shape of the life she had made here. She put her bag down. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at it all. She thought about the morning she'd climbed into Gus's wagon, the old travel bag, the stepmother watching from the window. At least now she'll be someone else's problem. She had been so certain that morning that she was being discarded. She had been right about the discarding. She had been entirely wrong about what it meant. Being sent away had been an ending. Yes. But it had also been, she understood it now, standing in this kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and the coffee she'd put on before they left, a direction. An arrow pointing here, to this mountain, to this man, to this life that she had built with her own hands, and her own mind, and her own stubbornness, and her own refusal, even when everything around her was telling her to be small, to be anything less than entirely herself. She put the kettle on. She sat in her chair. She opened the accounts book. Outside, she could hear Wyatt's voice in the yard talking to Hector about the stock, and Pete's voice answering something from the direction of the barn, and the mountain wind in the pines constant and low. The sound that had become the sound of home. The legal case was not over. Ruth was not done. She understood that. But Ruth was working now against a woman who had filed her own claim, who had a lawyer who knew what he was doing, who had a husband who stood beside her, and a valley's worth of people who had watched her and drawn their own conclusions. Ruth was working against someone who was no longer trying to survive the room she was in. She was working against someone who owned the room. The kettle sang. Evelyn got up and made herself coffee. And for the first time in 26 years, she did not check, not even briefly, not even in the small frightened place she usually checked without thinking whether she deserved to be comfortable. She was comfortable. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. The letter from Aldous Price arrived on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after they'd returned from Denver. Evelyn was at the kitchen table when Darnell brought it in, still in his coat, and the way he held the envelope carefully with both hands. The way people hold things they know are significant. Told her before she'd even seen the return address that it was the one they'd been waiting for. She set down her coffee. She read it standing up, which was how she'd learned to receive news she wasn't sure of, on her feet, braced ready. It was 2 pages. Legal language dense and precise, the kind of language designed to say things while appearing to say as little as possible. But the substance was clear enough. Price was withdrawing the claim. Citing new evidence, Pruitt had clearly gotten to Aldridge in San Francisco, and Aldridge had provided a sworn affidavit confirming the voluntary nature of the original sale. Citing procedural complications. Citing in language so careful it was almost funny, a reassessment of the viability of the covenant argument in light of recent counterfilings. How was done? Ruth was done. Evelyn set the letter on the table. She stood in the kitchen and breathed. She had expected to feel more. She had spent weeks braced for this, the legal maneuvering, Pruitt's careful work, the waiting, and she had imagined that when it resolved, it would resolve with some corresponding internal event. Some dramatic release. Some emotional conclusion that matched the scale of what they'd been through. What she felt instead was quieter than that. Something settling. The way a house settles after a storm. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the slow return of things to their right positions. The specific piece of something that had been threatening for a long time, simply stopping. She heard Wyatt come in from the yard. He saw her face before he saw the letter. "It's over," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 4 strides and picked up the letter. He read it the way he read everything, fully, without expression, processing before responding. When he set it down, he was quiet for a moment. "Pruitt got to Aldridge," he said. "Yes. And our counterfiling made their argument impossible. They can't claim to act for me when I've already acted for myself." She paused. "It's over." He looked at her. "How do you feel?" "Strange," she said honestly. "I expected to feel more." "What kind of more?" "I don't know. Triumphant, maybe. Or relieved in some bigger way." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I just feel settled." He nodded slowly. "That's what winning actually feels like," he said. "People expect it to feel like a battle ending. It feels more like a thing that was taking up space finally not being there anymore." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." He picked up the letter again. "I'll send this to Pruitt with a note. He'll want to file the closure documentation." "Yes." He started to turn toward the door, then stopped. He turned back. And he did something she hadn't seen him do before. He crossed the kitchen again, directly, without hesitation, and put his arms around her. Not a careful gesture. Not tentative. The full, certain embrace of a man who had decided something and was done waiting to act on it. She went still for exactly 1 second. Then she put her arms around him and held on. They stood in the kitchen like that, while the fire made its sounds, and outside the ranch moved through its morning, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the solid reality of him. This man who had taken one look at a woman the world had described as a consolation prize and had seen something else entirely. "Thank you," she said, muffled against his coat. "For what?" "For not settling," she said. "When they told you what I was, You could have decided they were right. His arms tightened slightly. I'm not in the habit of letting other people decide what's valuable, he said. I look at things myself. She almost laughed. I've noticed. He let her go. But he didn't step back immediately, and neither did she, and the distance between them, when they finally separated, was smaller than it had been before. I need to send that wire, he said. I know, she said. He went. She sat down and finished her coffee, and felt the particular quiet of a morning that was asking nothing more of her than to simply be in it. The news traveled through the valley the way all news did, fast and with elaboration. By the following week, Morrison had heard. He sent a note, brief and characteristic, glad it resolved cleanly. Ready to proceed whenever you are. G. Morrison. Wyatt showed her the note at supper. He's been waiting, she said. He's a patient man, Wyatt said. He's a fair one, she said. That's better. The water rights negotiation resumed the week after that. Evelyn was not present for all of it. It was legal and practical business that Wyatt and Morrison worked through with their respective lawyers. But she was present for the dinner that Morrison hosted at his spread when the agreement was finally signed, a dinner that included both families and several of the other ranchers in the valley, and which was, by the standards of the mountain community, a significant social occasion. Dorothy Price was there. Evelyn had known she would be. She had prepared herself the way she prepared for all difficult things, by deciding in advance exactly who she was going to be in the room, so that she didn't have to figure it out under pressure. Dorothy approached her before the meal, while people were still gathering, and her expression was different. Not warm. Dorothy Price was not a warm woman, and Evelyn had no interest in pretending she was. But the calculating assessment was gone, replaced by something more complicated. The expression of someone who had misjudged a situation and is navigating the aftermath. Mrs. Callahan, she said. Mrs. Price, Evelyn said. A pause. I understand the legal matter resolved in your favor, Dorothy said. It did, Evelyn said. Another pause. Dorothy looked at her directly for possibly the first time, not with the measuring sweep she'd used in the mercantile, but with actual eye contact. I should tell you, she said, and her voice was lower than usual, less performed. What your stepmother told me, I passed along more of it than I should have. I found her convincing, and I acted on it before I'd thought it through clearly. Evelyn regarded her. Yes, she said. You did. I'm not? Dorothy stopped. Tried again. I was wrong to do that. It was not an apology exactly. It was the closest Dorothy Price was going to come to one, and Evelyn understood that. Understood the shape of the pride involved, the cost of even this much. She thought about whether to demand more. She thought about what her mother would have done, her mother, who had been warm and precise in equal measure, who had understood that some things could be released without being condoned. I appreciate you saying so, Evelyn said. Evenly, without warmth and without coldness. That's all I'll need on the subject. Dorothy held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and moved away. May appeared at Evelyn's elbow approximately 4 seconds later. I watched that whole thing, May said in a low voice. I know you did, Evelyn said. You handled it well. I let it close, Evelyn said. That's different from handling it. May looked at her sideways. Since when do you make that distinction? Since I realized that winning a thing and then carrying it around aren't the same, Evelyn said. May was quiet for a moment. You've changed, she said. Not accusatory. Observational. Yes, Evelyn said. Since you came up the mountain. Since I came up the mountain, she agreed. May looked across the room at Wyatt, who was talking to Morrison with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered to him. He's better too, she said. Since you came, I want you to know that. I've known Callahan for 4 years. He's better. Evelyn followed her gaze. She watched him, the contained, weathered man who had been waiting on that mountain for something he hadn't been able to name, who had described his hopes as practical because he'd stopped believing he was allowed to hope for more than that. I know, she said softly. I can see it. Good, May said. Make sure he knows you see it. Men like that they don't ask to be seen. They just wait to find out if you're looking. Evelyn looked at May. When did you get wise? I've always been wise, May said. You just got smart enough to notice. The dinner was long and good, and the Valley people were warmer to her than she'd experienced before. Not because she'd won a legal case, but because she'd conducted herself through the whole of it in a way the mountain community seemed to respect. She'd been tested publicly in ways most people could see the shape of, even without knowing all the details. And she hadn't broken. She hadn't left. She hadn't apologized for taking up space. These things were noted. Hector shook her hand on the way out, which he had never done before, with the same formality he'd use with an equal. Pete told her the biscuits she'd contributed to the meal were better than anything the Morrison cook had made, which was extravagant praise from a 17-year-old, and she took it accordingly. On the ride home, the night was cold and very clear. The stars at this altitude, doing what stars at altitude did. Burning with a closeness that made the sky feel smaller and more personal than it did lower down. They rode side by side. "Good night," Wyatt said. "Yes," she said. "Morrison's pleased with the agreement." "I know. I saw his face when he signed it." Howe was quiet for a moment. 3 years I worked toward that," he said. 3 years of careful, slow work. I kept thinking one more problem, one more thing to resolve, and then it would get easier. "Did it get easier?" she asked. "It got different," he said. "You arrived and it got different. That's not the same as easier, but different in the right direction." She held the reins and let the cold air move over her face. "May says you're better," she said. "Since I came." He looked at her. "May talks too much." "She's right, though," she said. "Isn't she?" A pause. "Yes," he said. "She's right." "Good," she said. And then, because May had told her to make sure he knew she was looking, she said, "I see you, Wyatt. I want you to know that. I see how hard you work, and how carefully you treat people, and how much this place matters to you, and how much it costs you to let people in." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I see it. All of it." Howe was quiet for a long time. "I know you do," he said finally. "That's the thing, Evelyn. You're the first person in a long time who's looked directly instead of at the surface." She nodded. They rode. And the mountain received them quietly without ceremony, the way it received everything, with the massive patient indifference of something that had been standing long enough to know that what mattered was not what arrived, but what stayed. 2 weeks later, on a morning when the first real snow of deep winter had fallen overnight, and the ranch was muffled in white, and particular still, Wyatt came to the kitchen earlier than usual and sat across from her while she made breakfast and said without preamble, with the directness she'd come to love in him, "I want to ask you something." She turned from the stove. "All right. I want to know if you'd be willing to—" He stopped, started again. He turned his cup in his hands. "We married practically. For reasons that were practical on both sides, or that were supposed to be. I want to know if you'd be willing to marry differently." She looked at him. "We're already married," she said carefully. "I know that," he said. "I mean, I want to mean it differently. I want you to know that when I say this is your home, I mean it as a man who is choosing you, not as an arrangement, not as someone who arrived and proved useful." His jaw was set in the way it got when he was saying something that cost him. "I want to choose you, if you'll let me." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the snow sat on everything, and the mountain was enormous and white and close. She thought about the morning she'd left Millhaven, the old bag, the stepmother at the window, the hired wagon and the long cold road up into the high country, and the woman she'd been, then braced for disappointment, hollowed out by years of being told what she wasn't convinced that wanting things was a luxury she hadn't earned. She thought about what she was now. "Wyatt," she said. "Yes. I've been choosing you since about the 3rd week," she said. "I was just waiting for you to catch up." Something broke open in his face, not dramatically, not with the extravagance of men who had practiced being expressive. Just a crack in the careful surface warm light coming through the face of a man who had been waiting to find out if it was safe and had just found out that it was. He stood up. He crossed the kitchen. He took her face in both his rough hands and looked at her directly fully, the way he'd looked at her in the yard the first day she arrived. But different now. Different because now they both knew what the looking meant. "You are," he said, "the best thing that ever walked up this mountain." She put her hands over his. "You had better be sure about that," she said, "because I'm not leaving." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm sure." He kissed her, not tentatively, not like a question, like an answer, like the end of a very long conversation that had been building since a cold October morning when a woman with an old travel bag and 26 years of other people's smallness in her bones had walked into a yard and looked at a weathered man and refused even then, even braced for the worst, to be less than herself. The snow fell outside. The fire held. In the spring, when the mountain paths cleared and the valley turned green, and Morrison's water agreement was ratified. At the county level, people in Ridgefall talked about the Callahans. The way mountain people talk about things they've watched becomes solid with the particular respect reserved for what has been tested and held. Dorothy Price told her niece that Evelyn Callahan was the most capable woman in the valley, which was high praise from Dorothy, and everyone knew it. Hector told the new hand that Mrs. Callahan ran the household accounts, the way a good rancher runs stock. Nothing wasted, nothing, lost everything exactly where it needed to be. Pete told anyone who would listen that her biscuits were the best in the county, which was not about biscuits at all, and everyone understood that too. And May, who understood everything first and said it plainest, said simply, "That woman came up this mountain with nothing but herself." Turns out that was more than enough. There came an evening in late April when Evelyn stood on the porch of the ranch and looked out across the valley and the mountains beyond it, and she was not thinking about Ruth, who had written one final letter 6 weeks after Price withdrew a letter that Evelyn had read once and then placed in the fire, not with anger, not with triumph, just with the calm finality of a woman who was done carrying weight that wasn't hers. She was not thinking about her father, who she had written to twice briefly, without warmth and without coldness, because she was Anne Hargrove's daughter, and Anne Hargrove had believed that some doors should be left ajar even when you weren't walking through them. She was not thinking about legal cases or water rights or what any person in the valley thought of her. She was thinking about the way the light came in off the mountain in the evenings, the way her mother had described it. Her mother, who had known this land, who had loved it, who had believed it belonged to her daughter. She had been right. It did. Wyatt came to stand beside her, his shoulder warm against hers, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He gave her one without being asked, because he'd learned by now how she took it, and she'd learned by now that this, the small, unasked knowledge, the cup appearing at exactly the right moment, was how he said the things he didn't have words for. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "My mother," she said. He was quiet. She would have liked this, Evelyn said. The evening light here. She described it once she'd seen it when she was young, and the land still belonged to her family. She said the light here was different from anywhere else she'd been, like it knew it was almost done for the day and was trying to get everything in. Wyatt looked at the light on the mountain. "She was right," he said. "She usually was," Evelyn said. She felt his hand find hers at her side, his fingers closing over hers with the quiet certainty that had become over months the most familiar sensation in her life. "She'd be glad you're here," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I can feel it." They stood there together while the light did exactly what her mother had said it did. Tried to get everything in, touching the peaks and the pastures and the line of spruce along the creek and the white faces of the cattle moving in the far field, holding as long as it could before the mountain swallowed it. She thought about the woman she'd been on the morning she'd climbed into Gus's wagon. Braced, hollowed, convinced that love was a country she'd been born on the wrong side of the border of. And she thought about who she was now, standing on this porch with this man's hand in hers and this mountain at her back, and this life built board by board, day by day, from her own stubbornness and her own refusal to be less than she was. She had not become someone new. That was the thing she most wanted to understand clearly, and she did understand it. Standing in the last light, she had not become someone different. She had become more fully herself. The self that had always been there, competent, direct, deeply. Feeling unwilling to be small, had simply been given room. room to expand into her own shape instead of contracting to fit someone else's expectations. It had taken a mountain to give her that room. It had taken a man who looked at things himself. It had taken leaving the people who'd decided what she was before she had a chance to show them. She was the daughter her family had called ugly. She was the woman no one was supposed to choose. She was the problem they had packaged and sent away. And she was standing on a porch in the Colorado high country in the last light of an April evening, holding the hand of the man who had chosen her first and kept choosing her every single morning since, in the home she had built with her own mind and her own will and her own refusal to be anything less than entirely, completely, unapologetically herself. "Evelyn," Wyatt said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you for staying." She tightened her hand around his. "There was never anywhere else I was going," she said. "I just needed to find that out." The light held one more moment on the highest peak, that last brilliant, trying to get everything in light her mother had loved. Then it let go, and in the warm dark that followed on the mountain that had claimed her and kept her and known her for what she was. From the very first day, Evelyn Harper Callahan stood in the life she had chosen and felt for the first time and permanently, completely, irrevocably found. The daughter no one wanted had become the woman a mountain chose, and she had chosen it right back with both hands for the rest of her life.